First presentation is by Greenpeace, as outlined in CMD 18H 6.62. I understand Mr. Stensil, you'll make the presentation. Over to you.
Thank you, President Binder. Hello, bonjour. My name is Shawn-Patrick Stensil. I'm a Senior Energy Analyst with Greenpeace Canada. That said, today I don't feel like me. Today I feel like Bill Murray in that movie Groundhog Day. 5 years ago, I sat in this very place and made a presentation to the Canadian Nuclear Safety Commission, you. Just as today, I made comments on a controversial application by Ontario Power Generation to operate the Pickering nuclear station beyond its design life. And just like today, OPG claimed that the project was needed and economical, but its shareholder, the Government of Ontario, had exempted it from any review by the Ontario Energy Board. So we couldn't validate those claims. And just as today we were waiting for a study on the possible accident impacts of an accident to inform whether current emergency planning measures were sufficient to protect the public. And just as today, OPG couldn't definitively tell us whether the radioactive waste that's been produced at the station over the past 40 years would eventually go to some off-site storage facility. And just as today, OPG's shareholder, the Government of Ontario, was undermining public safety by encouraging population growth around the station. And just like today, OPG presented with slogans like, "Our last day will be our best day," while the public warned you what you need to do is avoid that one bad day that'll make none of it worth it. And just like today, the shadow over these hearings is the unexpected, whether from age, a regulatory blind spot, unforeseen event, or hostile action, an unexpected event that could cause irreversible harm to Toronto and Canadian society. That's your job. And finally, just like 5 years ago today, or 5 years ago, I'm going to tell you the following. It's time to close Pickering. First, it's unneeded. Pickering's political purpose is to pork barrel for votes in Durham Region. But ultimately, I think you have a responsibility under the Act to close the station given its location. Commissioners have said this week that the status quo is operation until 2020. I agree, and it should remain that. To start, Pickering is going to shut down. Ontario announced the station would close in 2010 when it acknowledged the station is too outdated to be rebuilt cost effectively. Quebec made a similar decision about Gentilly in 2012, and this month South Korea announced that Wolsung 1, which had already been rebuilt, would also close. So 10 out of 31 CANDUs internationally are closed or are closing due to high cost. That's 9 out of 22 in Canada. The CANDU industry is in decline. This is relevant for the Commission because you will oversee the safe decline of the CANDU industry. So today I ask two things. One, spur some momentum. We know the station is going to close. And two, rule in favor of our request for an environmental assessment under the Impact Assessment Act. This assessment would consider both OPG's approach to decommissioning as well as contingency plans in the event that Pickering becomes a de facto radioactive waste site beside Toronto. Notably, Durham Region has asked for transition plans to mitigate the social and economic impacts of the station's closure. It has also asked for compensation in exchange for carrying the risk associated with indefinite waste storage. These types of social and economic effects are what would be considered under an IAA review as opposed to one under the Nuclear Safety and Control Act. Unlike the Nuclear Safety and Control Act review, an IAA review may also make recommendations on the adequacy of CNSC regulations. This is a good thing and a good planning tool. It would assist with both planning before OPG applies for a decommissioning license in 2028. It would respond to local concerns, and I think it would strengthen trust in CNSC oversight over decommissioning in the long term. So in the case before you, evidence puts in doubt the licensee's capacity to make adequate provision for the protection of the environment. In fact, I submit it has a plan to reduce safety. and it has a track record of mismanaging oversight of off-site emergency plans. Of course, when I say the licensee, I am referring to OPG and its shareholder, the Government of Ontario. The province is the de facto licensee. It gives OPG direction, it appoints its board of directors, and it approves its business plans, such as the current proposal to continue operating Pickering. It also receives dividends from OPG and backstops its waste liability. OPG and the government are the same. And most importantly for the Commission, the province is responsible for the fifth level of defense in depth. This is protecting public from harm in the event of an accident. The province is responsible for two things that make up the fifth level of defense in depth: emergency preparedness and land use. The Ministry of Community Safety oversees emergency preparedness, the Ministry of Municipal Affairs oversees siting, the Ministry of Energy oversees OPG. These three bodies are your licensee. If OPG handled levels 1 to 4 of defense in depth as the province has, you'd revoke their license. The Ministry of Community Safety continues to show it is unable to adequately oversee nuclear emergency response. It lacks sufficient resources to oversee safety, and it also borrows staff from OPG to carry out its activities. This supports my point. You should consider OPG in the province as the licensee. According to the IAEA, there are 3 elements necessary to successfully implement every level of defense in depth: appropriate conservatism, quality assurance, and safety culture. I am confident that CNSC staff will be able to point to how OPG ensures all of these are implemented for the other levels of defense in depth. I have no confidence that CNSC staff can show how the Ministries of Community Safety and Municipal Affairs implement these for level 5, protecting the public from an accident. Show me the plan, show me the verification criteria. What's more, it's stated in the License Control Handbook, any change to the design or programs must have a neutral or positive impact on safety. This is in line with continuous improvement. I support it. If OPG were to take actions that knowingly reduce safety, CNSC staff would act. In contrast, the province has a policy of reducing safety around Pickering. It encourages population growth around the station and decreases the effectiveness of emergency measures. The province also knows that this is wrong and could invoke sanction from the Commission. Through FOI, I obtained a briefing note that went to the Minister in 2010 recommending eventual closure. One of the reasons it listed to support closure was running Pickering in an area of mandated provincial growth could trigger regulatory sanction. So the province is knowingly implementing population growth policies that undermine public safety. It knows OPG could be sanctioned for this. The province's intentional dereliction of duty to protect or improve public safety should impact your assessment of OPG's ability to carry out its responsibilities under the Act. In fact, I think it's reasonable to conclude that the licensee is unqualified for the license renewal. The licensee's encouragement of growth around the Pickering nuclear station is decreasing safety margins in the fifth level of defense. As population around the Pickering nuclear station has gradually increased over the past 40 years, so have the potential consequences of an accident. Like a frog in a pot of water brought slowly to boil, we have been unable or unwilling to acknowledge the increasing risk that accompanies the growing population around Pickering. Commissioner Velshi, on Monday you asked about the implementation of the Joint Review Panel recommendation that the CNSC engage with the Government of Ontario to develop land use planning around nuclear stations. Mr. Frappier responded that the Commission had engaged with the province and that they have updated their land use policy. While it's true Ontario's 2014 growth plan now includes energy generation facilities, the details of the plan show it's meaningless. Downtown Pickering, where we're sitting, is named as an urban growth centre. The licensee's policy is still to encourage growth and reduce public safety. The policy Mr. Frappier mentioned isn't fit for purpose or intended to maintain safety. This requires Commission action. And we see some data to this. Emergency time estimates are an indicator of safety decline, or emergency evacuation time estimates. We see a trend where ETEs have lengthened from 4 to 6 hours to evacuate on a good day, the 10-kilometer zone, to about 7 hours today. Worst case is 9. I have no numbers on evacuation for the new 20-kilometer contingency zone, but that should be available. All this is allowed to happen because the province and the CNSC have never set limits on population growth around Pickering. Other levels of defense in depth have a design limit, not level 5. That's an oversight that must be corrected. That said, the province's growth policy is encouraging reductions in public safety. That's grounds to reject OPG's license renewal. So I don't have time to discuss my final 2 points in depth, unfortunately. But in short, the periodic safety review used to support OPG's application lacks sufficient transparency to support the continued operation of Pickering, in my mind. I started filing access to information requests related to the basis for the PSR about 3 years ago, and the Commission has systematically denied information related to CNSC discussions on safety improvements that should be required to permit continued operation. Without such transparency, I don't think the Commission or the public can have the confidence that OPG is in fact making adequate or acceptable provisions to protect the environment. On this basis, I think you should reject the life extension. And finally, I'd ask you to rule in favor of the request for ruling filed by Greenpeace and SELA, asking for amendments to Section 5.4 of the License Control Handbook. It's poorly worded when I read it over and provides a loophole for Pickering to operate past 2024 without Commission approval. In conclusion, I don't think you can have confidence that OPG and its shareholder will make adequate provision to protect the environment. You should deny OPG's request to operate until 2024 and direct the company to immediately prepare transition plans for closure in 2020. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you. Okay, let's go right into the question period. Who wants to start? Dr. Lacour.
Thank you, Mr. Stensil, for this presentation. Incidentally, Groundhog Day is one of my all-time favorite movies.
It does have a happy ending, doesn't it?
Yes.
For Bill Murray. No,
When the station
for Bill
closes,
Murray,
yes.
I meant for you.
You're opposed to a 10-year license, but you support a 5-year license. From a purely safety point of view, can you justify this affirmation?
Requesting a 5-year instead of a 10-year license. Thank you for the question, and it's a very good one. I discussed this at the Bruce hearings as well. Mm-hmm. In Greenpeace's view, the move towards 10-year licenses in effect reduces a safety measure we have, a verification measure we have for checking in on CNSC staff and OPG as to both of their performances. And it basically reduces the ability of the public to scrutinize operations of both CNSC staff and OPG. And why that's important is what we learned with Fukushima and other major disasters is that they're effectively caused by regulatory capture of some kind. And how do you mitigate regulatory capture? The Commission will always be vulnerable to it because you deal with a very technical industry. It's like financial markets, and not a lot of people are trained in this area or have the patience to read all the documents. So you need these moments where the public can come in and be looking at these things from a different perspective and provide comment on, looking for where things haven't been implemented, and also providing views from the Canadian public. And, I'm a big believer that, to give an anecdote, one of the reasons I do environmental work is when I was a kid, my mom worked at a factory. And there was a period when I was a kid, she would come home from work every night and have horrible headaches and writhe around on the bed. And it turned out she did some research and found out that the glue they were using for these car carpets had some sort of toxin that caused this. It in fact shouldn't have been used. But it was her research that figured that out. She had an environmental sensitivity and she figured it out. She went to her union and they didn't do anything. They didn't want to bother And she eventually just called the Ministry of Energy or Labor, Freudian slip, and they shut the plant down for several days. And right there is an example of where we need to remember that Canadians are smart. They may not have the PhDs of the people on both sides of me, but they can find things out, especially when it affects them, and also see things from different perspectives because of how they're affected. And I'll list these again because I think it's really important. I mentioned these at the Bruce hearings. There's a whole line of regulatory improvements that have occurred because of public intervention at these hearings. And if you start doing those every 10 years, you will not get the opportunity to do that. You're going to lose the capacity in the civil society sector. It takes a lot to read these documents and keep up on the file. And that's something that the CNSC staff have never talked to us about. And to give some examples, in this hearing, OPG has been talking about its new multi-unit risk assessment. That was me in the 2013 hearings, where I raised an issue. And it led to a request for ruling that now CNSC staff talk about. We are a world leader in this. They're a world leader because of public intervention in that. I've suggested at the Bruce hearings that you also work that into your narrative as a commission, because it's good for other regulators in the world to hear that. Same thing in the last hearing. The main focus of my submission was that OPG has a policy that if it went over certain safety goals or limits, it had to develop a risk reduction policy and either do upgrades, analytic, whatever, but they had just ignored it. And so had CNSC staff. And I raised this in the hearings that required a risk reduction policy that they've been doing for the past 3 years, and that's a good thing. Those moments will not happen if you move to 10-year reactor extensions. I think this is very, very important.
I really got to challenge that, because not only you're completely ignoring the annual report, where you have again the ability to come and provide it. We do value the input, otherwise we wouldn't hold public hearings. So the input, I agree with you, the input has been very, very useful, at least the 10 years I've been at this podium, and we've acted on many of them. And in fact, we enhanced the requirement with the annual ROR, and some of the annual ROR will become a public hearing also in the communities. So I don't understand the reduction in public face.
So this talking point that comes up every time we talk about not moving to 10-year licenses. You have the annual meeting. And that's sufficient. To start off with, no one ever talked to anyone in the civil society community about whether that was an appropriate means of continuing to engage with interveners in maintaining capacity. That has been the line out of the commission and told to us. The parallel I would make, with all respect to Monsieur Leblanc, is for this hearing, it was originally scheduled in Curtis. And on day one, Monsieur Leblanc said that it's unfortunate that it can't be in Pickering, but in our experience, the Curtis facility meets all of our needs. It meets all of the needs of the Commission. It doesn't meet the needs of people living in the Pickering area. That site doesn't even have public transport. So it's a funny parallel, but it's being aware of the mindset that what you may think is sufficient is not. The second issue is, and Commissioner Velshi, I'm happy to work with this on you as you come into your presidency, is these hearings have bad procedure compared to other tribunals. We don't have the right to cross-examine even in an informal way, to gather information. And if you look at how improvements to safety have come out through these hearings since Fukushima, it's been hearing to hearing. The Commission has heard themes about how probabilistic risk assessment was being ignored, about emergency management, and it wasn't in a specific meeting. But the reason that happened is because in one meeting, we would often, with respect to staff, not be able to nail them down on the transcript about what we were actually trying to say and get them to confirm it. And in another tribunal, when we could directly ask, the example being the other night, President Binder, when you asked Where is the plan? This is a request for ruling. Where is the plan for distributing KI in the Toronto? There's a regulatory requirement. No one answered the question. It wasn't answered. And that makes it very difficult to intervene because you have talking points on both sides. That ends up being the transcript. And unlike the OEB, where you can gather evidence, have some agreement on facts, and then have a discussion about what that means for your deliberations. We can't do that here. It's very frustrating as an intervener in these hearings. So to your point, no. To be very clear, the August meetings are not acceptable as a replacement for these hearings. And beyond that, I think the Commission can go further to enhance its rules of procedure for both these hearings and the August meetings.
Thank you. Question? Ms. Penny?
Thank you for the presentation. I want to talk about the strategic environmental assessment. So what I'm trying to understand is what you're requesting, because when I look at what was in your supplementary as a letter to the Minister commenting on the consultation package for the new IAA, and you request that decommissioning get put on the project list. But then in the body of your original submission 62, you're asking for a strategic environmental assessment. And a strategic environmental assessment is usually on a point of policy. And so what I'm trying to understand is what you're really requesting. If you could elaborate for me, please.
Yeah, good question. And to start, and this is said in our request for ruling, we're in a bit of a regulatory vacuum on what triggers an EA, first of all. So that's why there's a bit of confusion. There is no compliance issue right now. If you guys decide to just ignore it, it can just kind of flow through. So we're appealing to the commissioners to say we should have an assessment outside of the Nuclear Safety Control Act assessments that are taking place under this new act, because these assessments will look at effects that aren't considered by the Commission. And whether that's a strategic assessment or an IAA assessment, there's two. One of the reasons we're asking for it, because it's about policy, is especially with nuclear waste, with radioactive waste. One of the biggest issues or challenges is there's the technical assessments, and you guys have the guides to that effect. There is also a social and ethical element that comes up, and economic, of how these impact communities. That's not necessarily addressed in CNSC policy for non-fuel radioactive wastes. If you look to the Nuclear Fuel Waste Act, in its objectives, it instructed the NWMO to, yes, look at the technical case, but also look at the ethical and social cases and conditions, impacts of its assessments. When you step back to the policy, the 1996 policy that predates, I don't know if everyone's familiar with the long history of how this came out. There's a general policy which is good that says it's polluter pays principle. But beyond that, there's not a lot of instruction on how you develop social license for these communities. What is a socially acceptable policy? And so under one of these environmental assessments, we'd be able to look at those issues. And I think for the Pickering site, it's significant because I believe there's a risk that this station becomes, as I mentioned, a radioactive waste site beside Toronto. And that won't be viewed well, but it may just happen through creeping up over time. And such an assessment would also be an independent conduit to inform policy that staff could then implement over the life cycle of decommissioning. Because in those assessments, recommendations can come out to influence CNSC regulations. So when you get to licensing, an example is exactly what Ms. Velshi, Commissioner Velshi, the question she asked about siting in the JRP is they recommended changes to standards to address issues they had heard about social expectations for safety within hearings. That's not really in the realm of this commission, but as I said in my opening remarks, is I think urging the federal government to do that would in fact increase confidence in the CNSC's oversight when you get to the licensing stage, because some of these issues that are outside of the scope and expertise of CNSC staff will be better dealt with under that act.
Thank you.
I'm not sure you answered my question, but
I'm not sure either.
Judge Mather?
Thank you. I wanted to clarify my understanding based on your questions raised in slide 6 about operations beyond 2014. And just to confirm what staff, because they presented on their presentation here on slide 28 of their CMD H6-C, that commission approval would be required to operate any unit beyond December 31st, 2024. My understanding of their presentation was that this was not a delegated task, this was a commission task. Understanding that safe storage now is, as you understood, part of the operations, but any operations from a power production beyond that, any change to the request would require approval at this level versus at staff level.
Jerry Frappy, for the record, that's correct. Actually, the quote that he has on his slide there, the underlined part is not in the LCH there right now. I think it might have been in an earlier version, and that was an error. So in the section 15.4, end of commercial operation, it is very clear. If you just strike out the part that's underlined, that's what's in there now. So it would read that the licensee, well, I'll read it. The license condition also ensures that operation beyond December 31st, 2024 would constitute a change in the license basis requiring approval by the Commission, period. I think the other thing that's important, independent of that line, is we also have, as you know, putting restrictions on the effective full power hours. So if they wanted to go beyond 295,000, then again, that would be something that would have to come to the Commission, not to staff. And then finally, in the integrated implementation plan that comes out of the PSR, there are also things that are very clear that they must stop operation in 2024. Otherwise, there would be a whole bunch of activities they would have to do, and that would have to be coordinated with the Commission.
Randy Lockwood, for the record, I already did acknowledge earlier in the hearing that we would not be operating beyond 2024. We never had any intention to without Commission approval.
So it sounds to me like there's a violent agreement with your recommendation on this one.
Yes, that's good news. But again, note, this is what is good about interveners participating, is we flagged a line that was different from what was in public communications originally. That said, I'd also like, on the license control handbook, I'm not sure what version I'm working off of now. This is the one, I think, from April. When I said it was poorly worded, I would also like to flag for the Commission that the proposal that OPG is talking about is to run 2 reactors till 2022, and then the other 4 shut down in 2024. That I didn't, in the version of the license control handbook that I have in front of me, I haven't seen that reflected. And it was reflected in the previous 2013 license control handbook, these types of dates. It's significant because there's timelines that are tied to, I think, submission of the SOP and SAPs that are based on when a unit closes. It's like 3 years before a unit closes, you have to do X. So if those dates are not acknowledged in the license control handbook, you're going to have regulatory confusion.
Okay, so that's a good clarification. OPG?
Randy Lockwood, for the record. As I've already stated earlier in the hearing, and as we submitted a letter in June of 2016, June 28, 2017, my mistake, stating our intentions to operate Pickering, the end of commercial operations ceasing the end of 2024. From a business perspective and a planning perspective, to test the economics and ensure everything makes sense, we did run a business case that considered operations of 6 units to 2022 and 4 units to 2024, strictly from a business case. Anything, and if the economics for that works out, which it did, then it makes good sense to carry forward. But simply, that was a business case summary.
So it's not a regulatory requirement, staff?
Jerry Frappy for the record. No, there's no regulatory requirement for them to close two of the units. That's not what this license indicates. It indicates that it's up to them. Having said that, there may be business reasons why they would want to do that, as they have already done with two of the units at the station. But that is not, in our view, an end of commercial operations of the nuclear power plant, since even if they close two, they'd still have four that's operating, which is a pretty big plant.
Go ahead.
This is an interesting discussion. As I mentioned in the 2013 License Control Handbook, these types of dates were set out. And the reason we raised this issue is the original letter that went from OPG to the Commission. In the appendix, they mentioned these dates. These were also the dates that were used in the when they were at the OEB. And the reason why you should look into this further, one, it's for compliance on the SOPs and SAPs, because if you move back to 2022, I think some of them require submission next year. So if OPG already knows that, they should know that. Two, this is very important because I participated in these hearings with the assumption that this was their proposal. So I worry about a bait and switch at this point. It's gotten a little sketchy. And the other issue is, again, if you're moving to shut down all 6 in 2024, we've seen requests from the region for transition plans to mitigate social and environmental effects. Shutting down the whole plant in 2024 will be very different from shutting down 2 in a staged way, moving 500 workers to something else, and then doing the others in the next step. So this has implications, I think, for other aspects of the license renewal that you should look into.
I really like some clarity. If there's a business decision to stop some operation earlier, 2022, what is the regulatory implication of that?
Jerry Frappy for the record. So under the current operating license, they have the right to operate and generate power, and they also have the right to shut it down in an orderly, safe way. The sustainable operation plan that we're saying they have to provide to us 5 years before the end of operations is the end of operations of all the units at the Pickering site, because that's the point where they start transitioning in a big way into being something quite different. If today or next year or before 2022 they decided for business reasons they were going to stop operations of a unit, we would expect them to be telling us about that. And then they would have to have a plan for an orderly shutdown of that plant from a technical perspective, but it would not require them to have a sustainable operation plan and all that in place 5 years before they make that decision.
Rem Jima for the record, Mr. President, if you allow me here, with respect to the LCH, we definitely like to put clarity on the fact that in the LCH itself, page 140 of 176, Mr. Stensil talks about LCH for Part 1, LCH for Part 2. In addition to what was said by our colleagues, I'll pass it on to Dr. Omar with respect to the SARP as it pertains to the operation and the plans of OPG. In every regulatory requirement, it requires OPG to come to us at minimum whenever there is a change, and with the drop deadline being the December 2024. So the LCH goes in detail with the shell statement by which that the licensee will have to notify the CNSC of their plans. The safety case is the bounding element. Anything they're going to do within the safety case, if they want to go shut down earlier, that is rendering the site safer. But I'll pass it on to Dr. Omar to give you the detail associated with the SARP, and all these are referenced in the LCH.
Omar, for the record, I just wanted to clarify the point. If OPG shut down a unit before 2024, what's the impact of the SOP, for instance, which is the Sustainable Operation Plan? The current plan submission by OPG of the first SOP is December 2019. And in this one here, it will be built on previous submission of the SOP. So we expect that submission to be what we call mature, addressing all concerns and challenges of approaching the end of commercial operation. So if an early unit or 2 units shut down, the SOP will be submitted annually to the CNSC staff review and inspection, and any impact of early shutdown of any unit will be reflected immediately in the annual submission, and then we'll take it from there. The impact on safety or safe operation of the entire station will not be impacted by that change, because all the provisions, including workforce management, the fitness for service of all components and structures, will be indicated in the first submission of the SOP.
Mr. Majima, for the record, sir, if you allow me to go to page 141 of 176 of the LCH, again for clarity and for the record. What Dr. Omar has mentioned, and it is clearly stated in the LCH under SOP specific requirements. So this is specific requirement. It is the Shell statement is being implemented or being referred to. The sustainable operation plan shall be developed and implemented at least 5 years preceding the permanent shutdown of the first unit of Pickering NGS, and for any subsequent Pickering units to be shut down, the SOP shall be updated using lessons learned from previous applications, and we report to you on the annual basis. So the Shell statement does exist, and the requirements from regulatory perspective do exist.
This is my point.
Go ahead.
So I hope I'm working off the same version, but when this is what triggered me to say that this seems sloppy, is saying that the SOP shall be developed and implemented at least 5 years preceding the permanent shutdown of the first unit. So, yeah, that assumes 2024, if it's December 2029. My assumption, intervening in these hearings, is that 2 units will be shut down in 2022. So this is a question of, what is the proposal in front of us that we're being consulted on? And when I saw that, I'm like, well, it's not the usual kind of issue Greenpeace will worry about, but I'm like, it's just kind of sloppy, because it just affects when things get reported. Perhaps it should have something in there, if there was guidance on when Pickering A shuts down, like if OPG decides to operate Pickering A beyond this, they need to notify the commission by.
No, that's not. What I understood staff is saying is if they decide to close earlier, there'll be an earlier SOP or an earlier update. That's the way I understood.
Sir Majima, for the record, that is very true, sir. And to confirm to Mr. Stensil the fact that, again, in the LCH, the license condition ensures that operations beyond December 2024 would constitute a change in the licensing basis requiring approval by the Commission. 2024 is the last date that they can. Anything before, if they want to shut down within, as I said, the bounding element of the safety case, it's a no-go beyond 2024 without your approval.
Okay, look, there's lots of other issues I'd like to talk about. I think we have heard enough. Maybe the final word on this one. We have lots of other parties that I'd like to bring to the conversation.
Robin Manley, for the record, if the Commission would allow us to just put our perspective on that particular story briefly. So OPG completely understands the requirement both in the previous license condition handbook of our existing license and in the license condition handbook that is proposed in front of us today. We have been compliant with the existing license condition handbook with provision of sustainable operation plans from about 2011 through 2016, and then in 2017 we submitted a strategic plan aligned with what we submitted in our June 2017 letter that talked about end of commercial operations in 2024. So all the way along, we've been meeting the compliance requirements, we've been developing the plans, we've been communicating them with the CNSC, and it's clearly understood by us what the requirements are.
Randy Lockwood, I just want to add one more point to make this entirely clear, and it speaks to the openness and transparency that we committed to. As you know, and we've heard about during these hearings, we completed a PSR for 10 years with the idea that end the commercial operations in 2024. Very clear, for the station. In addition, we were to supply the shutdown dates for Pickering, which we did June 28th of 2017. As well, that we intended to shut down the Pickering station at the end of 2024. I will also add that you will find all of this information, application and this letter, posted on our website. In addition, I've communicated our plans to the public in the way of community information sessions. I've communicated those to staff, our community advisory committee, and as well local community councils.
Okay, another question, please.
So I know, Mr. Stensil, you never need help in what you're asking for, but I just wanted to clarify that in your proposed amendment to the license condition handbook, it's not only not delegating commission authority, but you wanted review by the public as well,
Yes.
which, and I just wanted to, we hadn't discussed that, but just that is in there.
Thank you.
My question is on your slide number 5 on the periodic safety review and following OPG's comment around transparency, where you're now claiming that it isn't sufficient, whether it's OPG or CNSC staff. So perhaps you can elaborate on specifically what you were looking for that you weren't able to get and why that would be helpful for the Commission in its deliberations, please.
Thank you for the question. About 3 years ago, I started preparing for this hearing and trying to gather it's very difficult to get information, so it's time-consuming, and started putting in access to information requests. What interests me most is what are the safety upgrades that are being done and are not being done for this 4-year application. This is very relevant to safety because, again, back to the Groundhog Day issue, is 5 years ago, we had an application where OPG said we're going to run to 2020. We're not going to refurbish the plant and upgrade to a higher level of safety, closer to modern plants. And when there were cost-benefit decisions that happen when you decide how long you're going to operate the plant. Cost-benefit decisions, to my understanding, they partly use the probabilistic risk assessments, but time is also a factor of what is the benefit or the cost. And so when they applied in 2016, theoretically, if you run to 2020, you have a shorter amount of time, so there'll be less benefit and more cost, theoretically. Now we have a situation where they've come back again and said, we want to run to 2024. It's Groundhog Day. And it's for a short period. I have no clarity on what their baseline was. Are they using just this 4-year period? Or did they go back and reestablish a baseline from the original date? If they had applied in 2013, theoretically, I don't have access to the data, they would have looked at all that and said, okay, we're going to run for 10 more years. It may have affected those decisions. And what we've heard within the scope of this hearing are the good things, the safety upgrades, the strengthening of programs. What we haven't heard is the discussion of what wasn't taken up in this analysis. And what I was looking for was, okay, what was on the list and what wasn't on the list? That is a fair discussion. I think at the Bruce hearings last month, the lawyer for the Saugeen made an interesting comment where they want to be involved when it comes to, I think, around fisheries decisions, in cost-benefit decisions, because they want to make sure their values are reflected in those discussions. I have no access to any of that information, and for me, that is key. OPG is saying it's appropriately safe. I don't know what their measure is. And the first request I asked for actually came from an OEB document. And I know, Commissioner Velshi, you are now on the OEB. The OEB has a lot more transparency than the Commission in terms of filings. And OPG had submitted to the OEB its technical case for the continued operations to 2022 and 24. And there was a line in there that basically said the cost effectiveness will also depend on agreement with the regulator on the time period under which these safety upgrades will be considered. So there was some sort of agreement between the two. And for the new commissioners, one of the issues with the vulnerabilities of the Canadian Nuclear Safety Commission's framework is it's not prescriptive. That can also be a quality. But where it's vulnerable is it involves a lot of negotiation between staff and OPG because it's not prescriptive. There's not a clear rule to say compliance. So they have to decide on what is acceptable. And it's that agreement that I am often interested in, because that's where the compromise on public safety may happen to the benefit of OPG's financial case. And when I asked for that line in an access to information request to the Commission, can you provide me all documents on what the content of those discussions were, I got a letter back, and it was kind of unusual for an access to information request because it said, these are all redacted, and we invite you to participate in the hearings 2 years from now to show your views on an access to information letter. It was very odd. But to me, this just prevented, I was thinking about this 3 years ago, this has just basically prevented me from making any valuable comment to the Commission on these types of issues. And without that information, I can't have confidence that they are in fact going for the best. So not in short, but that's a summary of my concerns.
Thank you. So I'll get staff to comment on what we've heard from the intervener.
Jerry Frappy, for the record, I'll ask Omar to talk a bit about the PSR process, because I think that's really what is being asked about. But I would say that there was a PSR done by the licensee with a date of the 2020. That was done before and was important to our last hearing. And when they decided they were going to go till 2024, then that was one of the requirements that was placed on them by the regulator, that they must update that PSR now that they're going to be doing for an extra 4 years. So certainly at that point they had to take a look and see what is appropriate, given that they are going to continue operating a little bit longer. And so with that, I'd ask Mr. Omar to talk about how we looked at the various meetings of the gap between modern standards and what they're proposing.
Well, Omar, for the records, when OPG hinted at least that they may go beyond 2020, we sent a formal letter requesting OPG to perform a PSR for going from 2020 to 24. The PSR itself is a systematic, internationally recognized process to confirm how close the station requirement are to current codes and standards, and whether the licensing basis will continue to be validated, and what kind of improvement can be added to enhance the safety. The station itself is safe, but just to enhance the safety, to bring it as practical as possible to a new build. And the last requirement or objective of the PSR is to ensure that programs, including process, procedure, and so on, are in place to ensure the effective implementation of these safety enhancements. The PSR includes 4 very specific steps. The first step is to establish what we call the basis document, and this is more or less a contract between the regulator and the operator on how the PSR will be conducted, what kind of coverage of code and standard, and what methodology will be used, and what will be the output of that. The second step is to perform a review of what we call 15 safety factors. Every safety factor addresses a specific aspect of operation or design, human performance, safety performance, radiation protection, and so on and so forth. And these are the most extensive review, and part of that review will include all relevant new code and standard, as well as what we call task review based on internationally recognized IEA document. The output of that, we call it gaps, meaning a finding of a potential requirement to satisfy the current code and standard that will be considered in the next steps that will lead ultimately to enhancement in safety to bring that station closer to a new build. So the next step is what we call global assessment, that you take all the output of the safety factor reports review and have all consideration, including defense in depth, what do you have, good practices, and you assess the global assessment, global safety of operating beyond that 2020 to 2024, and have a determination whether related to continued validity of the safety case to operate to 2024. Out of this, it comes the integrated implementation plan, and the current one includes 72 actions.
I think the process is well known and well described.
Sure.
The question was, is any of this in the public domain?
Okay.
Sir Jamal, for the record, we published CMD in part 1, and again, this is for clarity. I have no issues at all with the concerns raised by Mr. Stensil. So if you look at page 18, section 3.3 of part 1 CMD clearly lists the references that were established by staff when exchanged with OPG. Those references are publicly available. With respect to the cost-benefit analysis, I would like to make a comment that no regulator in the world should pretend that they can do a proper cost-benefit analysis, because we don't have the expertise nor the knowledge that the operator does. The USNRC and other regulators, when they were audited on the cost-benefit analysis, they told them, don't do it because you do not know what you're doing. So what we do ourselves is we look at the cost-benefit analysis with respect to safety enhancement. Is the safety enhancement adequate so that there is no compromise? So based on risk-informed decision-making, there are safety enhancement the licensee must take without any cost-benefit analysis, and that is referred to in our CMD. So risk-significant upgrades are done, no debate about it. So, but
Were they all in the public? That's what I think. So the intervener said they asked for the documentation, didn't get the documentation.
Well, I heard he got the documentation, but
Okay, OPG.
Steve Gregores, Deputy Site Vice President, Pickering, for the record. As Mr. Omar discussed, Pickering completed an extensive PSR. Just for perspective, so aligned with regulatory requirements, international standards, it took 100 people 2.5 years to do this. That is the level of effort, okay? When we completed this PSR, as Mr. Omar said, we identified improvement opportunities as part of the Global Assessment Report. That Global Assessment Report is published. It's on opg.com. It's available. The Global Assessment Report identifies all safety improvement opportunities identified through the PSR process. It also clearly explains how those safety improvement opportunities are grouped based on commonality, how they're ranked specifically to safety improvement significance, and then how they're chosen or not chosen. All laid out in the Global Assessment Report. It's available to the public. Based on safety alone and the safety improvement opportunities and the biggest safety improvements, actions were then chosen, again shown in the report, and those actions were then translated into the Integrated Implementation Plan. And those actions and the Integrated Implementation Plan are available for the public. So what I'd like to say is nuclear safety, transparency, two key fundamental commitments for us. This is a perfect example of dealing with safety improvements, how we've made decisions and made it available to the public.
So, Mr. Stensil, you're shaking your head. Have you seen this global assessment report and all the references to it?
Yes, I've seen the global assessment report. What we did not hear in this back and forth was why all access to information requests I have filed asking for staff's comments on proposals of upgrades have been withheld. I assume they're not references in that document. My fear for the Commission is you're being handed a huge document, and it can be very impressive. In the same way that an emergency plan can seem impressive. We've handled everything. But it's drilling down into those details to actually see how those decisions are made that I have not had access to, and I did not hear a response why the Commission, why I got this friendly letter saying we encourage you to participate in 3 years, and no, you can't have that information. Something in French, it's c'est louche, something doesn't make sense. Until I have access to that type of information, I can't have confidence, and I don't think you should, going forward.
If you're talking about the deliberation and operation of staff, you're talking about the ATIP, and this is not a place for us to discuss the ATIP legislation, which is a whole different
It is not a whole different thing.
Okay.
I'm not done my comments to Commissioner Velchi's statement. If you look closely at my submission, one of the reasons why I was worried about this is I reference a briefing note that went to the Minister when Pickering was originally closed. Thank you, Jerry. And one of the comments that it made was when they had done their original periodic safety review, PSR1 that's referred to now, what they found is cost-benefit analysis showed that little safety improvement would have been derived as a result of investing $100 million. It would result in very little safety improvement. So notes like this were being given to the Minister of Energy that even if they invest a lot of money, they're not going to get much, even in refurbishment, they're not going to get a lot of safety improvement. But what we hear here is we've done this wonderful PSR and we're approaching, the safety of a new reactor. This does not add up to me. And ATI is, in fact, part of this process, respectfully, Mr. Binder. So a lot of my submissions have been influenced by it or informed by it. I'm not finished. And when you look at, I'm not finished, excuse me, Commissioner Velchi, again, at the Ontario Energy Board, what you'll often see, OPG will file documents saying we would like this included on rates for X safety improvement. And they will give you 3 scenarios, medium, high, and low for benefit. They release that to the Ontario Energy Board. We have no equivalent at the Canadian Nuclear Safety Commission for these types of decisions. And I would encourage you, I can't see it being done in time for this project, but for other PSRs, for the Bruce, you're doing them every 10 years, I think improvements can be made on how those discussions take place publicly. And we haven't had them this time, and that's why I'm saying this PSR, it's a wonderful large document, but I can't verify it.
Thank you. And our staff, last word on this.
Jerry Frappi for the record. So, as mentioned, the IIP is available in the public. It's attached to our submission. The global assessment report is available to the public. And the safety factor reviews that are what we undertake, if you like. So each one of the I forget the number of safety factor reports there are has been reviewed by staff, and that's available upon request.
I want to move on to emergency management. We have a lot of people hanging here and are willing to talk about this. I think we have heard enough about the previous topic, and we have opportunity to re-raise it a bit later on. But right now, I'd like to start with the Office of the Fire Marshal. The intervener made a lot of comments on that. We also have, I understand, our Dr. Kyle from our Durham Regional Health Department available. We have Environment Canada and Climate Change and Health Canada. So all of these are available to discuss this topic, which is very prominently discussed in this intervener submission. So, Officer of the Fire Marshal, over to you, please.
For the record, I'm Mike Morton, Director of Emergency Management with the Office of the Fire Marshal and Emergency Management. As the legislated off-site lead for emergency management, emergency preparedness for nuclear emergencies in Ontario, we very much appreciate the opportunity to participate in this public hearing. As we discussed during the hearing on Tuesday, as well as at previous meetings of the Commission, and we have heard, Ontario has strong emergency plans in place for nuclear and radiological incidents, including very specific plans for the Pickering Nuclear Generating Station. These plans are consistent not only with the Canadian Standards Association N1600 standard for nuclear emergency management in Canada, but are also consistent with international guidance such as IAEA, GSR 7 and GSR 2. These plans, as well as the scenarios that they're based on, have been developed in close consultation, not only with CNSC and Health Canada staff, but they have been put out for public review through a 75-day review period, and we received, as we reported on Tuesday, 1,600 comments in response to that. All of those comments were carefully reviewed by an international advisory group that has provided us a validation of those scenarios, as well as 15 recommendations on how we can even further enhance our programs. Many of those recommendations have been addressed in the 2017 PNURP, which was released in November, and are further reflected in the site-specific plan released in March of 2018. As reported yesterday in the hearing, we are also seeking global review of these programs. We are confident that our programs meet national and international standards, and we are working closely with Health Canada to support the visit of an EPREV mission to Canada that will assess these programs through peer review, experts from around the world, to look at all of the aspects of our emergency management programming. While we've gone on the record over the last days on a number of aspects of emergency preparedness, including the contents of the plans, some of the upgrades to the plans, we spoke a lot on Tuesday about evacuation, we've referenced public alerting. We did want to go on record to provide some further clarity around our arrangements related to distribution of KI, and particularly when KI would be used as one of the protective actions that is available to us, along with our primary protective actions of evacuation and sheltering. So with the Commission's permission, I'd just like to turn over to our Chief Scientist, Laurie Whitcomb, who's sitting to my left. Laurie can provide some background as to a little bit further in-depth as to the scenarios and planning, understanding this is an area that the intervener has expressed interest in. Laurie?
Please.
Laurie Whitcomb, off-mem for the record. As Mike just stated, the PNURP, we have spoken over the course of the last few days how the PNURP outlines the provisions that are already in place for KI distribution in the automatic action zone, the detailed planning zone, and the contingency planning zone. We have also outlined over the last few days how the PNURP revision that was undertaken in 2017 incorporates the principles of optimization of strategy and has always incorporated the fundamental principle of reducing or avoiding entirely any radiation exposure. The detailed modeling that underlies the planning basis in the current PNURP indicates that the deposition beyond the automatic action zone and the detailed planning zone is not anticipated in most accident scenarios. In the highly unlikely and low probability scenario that deposition is anticipated to occur beyond the detailed planning zone, the consumption of KI in specific sectors of the contingency planning zone and the ingestion planning zone would be implemented. To be clear, in a severe accident, KI consumption in the automatic action zone is a default protective action. KI consumption in the detailed planning zone for those who are not able to evacuate prior to the start of the release would be implemented under the authority of the Chief Medical Officer of Health of Ontario. If KI is necessary beyond the DPZ, in the CPZ or the IPZ, a keyhole strategy would be employed. That is, for populations in sectors that align with the direction of the plume, KI would be recommended as a protective action for those sectors that cannot be evacuated. As we have mentioned previously, we are also undertaking a technical study at the current time. That technical study will be used to inform any decisions that are necessary with regard to the revision of our zones and KI distribution. I would also like to reiterate that residents of the CPZ and the IPZ that are concerned about radioiodine exposure can visit the Prepare to Be Safe website at any time to order KI for themselves and their families.
Before, I'm sure that you just raised many questions, but before we do this, I'd like Health Canada, if you want to make a statement right here and now. Health Canada? Yeah, go ahead, please.
Yes, this is Brian Eyre, Director of Radiation Protection Bureau of Health Canada, for the record. So I just want to start by saying that we appreciate the opportunity to participate in the hearing. And from the federal perspective, we believe that our federal arrangements, as specified in the Federal Emergency Response Plan and the Federal Nuclear Emergency Plan, are sound, well aligned with relevant IEA safety standards, and we have validated that through many exercises with the province of Ontario and in other situations. With respect to some of the specific comments from Mr. Stensil, we also believe that the current version of the Ontario Provincial Nuclear Emergency Plan is an adequate plan. We can provide a bit more information on our view on this, and I would like to hand the microphone over to Mr. Kevin Buchanan, who was the lead on undertaking the technical hazard assessment that we did in support of the senior position.
Kevin Buchanan, for the record. So, as Brian had said, so Health Canada does believe that the current version of the PNERP is adequate. And just to restate that, the current version of the PNERP is adequate. Health Canada contributed a technical study to inform the current version of the PNERP, as we previously heard. So the modeling in the report used two source terms that represented different INS level 7 events in terms of the iodine content. And this has come up before, and I need to reinforce this, that the modeling that was done did represent an INS level 7 event in terms of the iodine content. So we can put that debate to rest. The source terms were provided by the CNSC, and Health Canada respects and relies on their expertise and guidance regarding its applicability to emergency planning. The modeling that was done previously by Health Canada indicated that some intervention levels might exceed the operational intervention levels in the previous PNERP. So, stated in a different manner, the plume exposure zone could extend beyond the previously defined primary zone in the 2009 PNERP. So if you're not familiar with the designated plume exposure planning zone, this is a zone that's defined within Reg Doc 210. So at the conclusion of this work, Health Canada recommended that the province of Ontario increase its zone sizes to adequately protect the public, which they did. We understand that this led to the inclusion of the contingency planning zone, and we are very happy to see that the results adopted into the current version of the 2017 PNERP. So to clarify this improvement for everybody, in terms of international standards, the 2017 PNERP addition of a 20-kilometer planning zone beyond the 10-kilometer detailed planning zone addresses the same response issue covered in IEA's recommendations for urgent protective action planning zones, which is, if it hasn't come up before, between 15 to 30 kilometers. So it falls within the ranges recommended by the IEA. Okay? So now from the 2017 PNERP, the improvements are described as follows. The contingency planning zone is an area beyond the 10-kilometer detailed planning zone where contingency planning and arrangements are made in advance so that during a nuclear emergency, protective action can be extended beyond the detailed planning zone as required to reduce the potential for exposure. So we had heard the response from OPG, and Health Canada accepts the Lori Whitcomb's explanation of how that would be interpreted within the contingency planning zone. So Health Canada believes that the current version of the PNERP, if executed as intended, represents a substantial improvement from the 2009 version. So I'll make the following statement, and it does tie in with Lori's comments. So because the intent of this statement in the 2017 PNERP and the definition of the designated plume exposure planning zone, Health Canada recommends and would expect that all arrangements in the contingency planning zone be reviewed to ensure that they are consistent with the hazard assessment and implementable and executable. And we had heard from Lori that this is in fact the case.
So the only missing piece...
For the record, just to close, so to reiterate, we believe that the PNERP is adequate, and certainly at the federal level, we remain ready to implement our federal arrangements to support the province if required. And just to close this comment, we would also just want to reiterate that as was previously mentioned earlier during the hearing, we are working with our federal, provincial, and industry partners to plan for an IAEA peer review of our arrangements against the relevant IEA safety standards, and that planning, the planning for that peer review is in process, and the review will be conducted within the coming year.
Thank you for that. So the only missing piece is on the execution, and we have Dr. Kyle here, who I assume going to be the trigger for make this thing in case of an emergency. So maybe you can shed some light as to how this is working or will work in case of an unlikely.
So Robert Kyle, Commissioner and Medical Officer of Health, Durham Region Health Department. To my right is Marianne Petrusiak, who's an epidemiologist who can answer any questions the Commission may have either now or later with respect to cancer and that sort of thing. So what I would say is this. I'm an implementer. The PNERP, the site-specific plans, and the Durham Region Emergency Master Plan, although we may have input into the latter, we are more implementers, and I really don't have any comments as to the adequacy of either the PNERP or the site-specific response. Currently, as a department, we are responsible under our master plan for the pre-distribution of KI pills within 10 kilometers to vulnerable groups, namely schools, child care centers, long-term care homes, and certain emergency personnel. Our current focus this year is on replacing the current stock of KI pills whose shelf life is expiring. If we were to, so the other thing that we do in addition to pre-distribution is we work with OPG when it was directed to pre-distribute to all residents and businesses within the 10K zone. Our role was more on the communication side of things and I'm going to say health information side of things. We have up to 5 pharmacies within the 10K zone that are stocked with KI pills, and 3 times a year through press releases primarily, we advertise the availability of local stocks, and we also direct interested members of the public to be prepared to be safe website should they want to access KI pills. So if pre-distribution was to expand beyond 10K, there would certainly be some capacity challenges. Depending on how far, you'd get into multi-jurisdictional, I guess, coordinated requirements. So to our west is the city of Toronto, to the east, depending on how far you go out, our more rural health units, Haliburton, Kawartha, Pine Ridge, and Peterborough. So there need to be a lot of coordination to make that happen, but we would do our part to work with OPG or whoever is directed to lead pre-distribution. I don't really have an opinion on how far pre-distribution should go. Should it be 20K? Should it be 50K? But what I would say is the farther you go, the more complicated it is, the more multi-jurisdictional it will be, and quite frankly, we would need assistance from the province. As you heard from the Office of Fire Marshal and Emergency Preparedness, I would not direct the public to ingest. It would be the Chief Medical Officer of Health. Yes, I think those are my preliminary comments. Happy to answer any questions, but the further out you go, the more problematic it is. And finally, what I would say is the voluntary approach does not work if people are stuck in their cars or otherwise unable to evacuate if a plume happened to, if they happen to be exposed to a radioactive plume. So I do think if that is a serious consideration, you do need to think about a pre-distribution strategy, whether it's the entire population, whether it's particularly vulnerable populations, say children and youth, who you're most concerned about with respect to thyroid cancer. The depth and breadth, all those options have pros and cons, and you need to give some thought to that. And finally, there's the issue of payment. So any instrument you could use to require OPG to pay for it, I think would be appreciated by multiple stakeholders. Thanks.
Randy Lockwood for the record. If I may, President Binder, we've looked at various pieces through the hearing here, disjointed in my opinion. I believe what I would like to, because I'm actually concerned about members of the public listening to this, because we're talking about it in a kind of a disjointed manner. It's paramount that they understand in the unfortunate event we had that happen today, right now, that we're prepared to go, and that we have tested that in Exercise Unified Control in December 2017. So what I would like to ask Commission permission to turn this over to Scott, and let's start back from the beginning and tell the story how this would unfold, if you would allow us that permission.
By all means, there's lots of other questions that I would like to know, so really focus. What a concern over the last few days is we did not get clarity about I think we have clarity on what happened in the 10 kilometer zone. We're not sure about the 20, and we definitely don't know about the 50. And we really would like to see the detailed plan to answer your question. If it happened tomorrow morning, who does what and how, and where are the pre-distributed kind of a thing. So that's what's really missing. So if you can shed some light onto that aspect, it'd be welcome.
Randy Lockwood for the record. So I will turn it over to Scott Burns, but I do think it's important that we start from the beginning to make sure we understand how things would unfold.
I just want to reiterate what President Binder has said. I don't think we need to worry about the primary zone now. I think the focus should be on the other two.
Randy Lockwood for the record. Understand, but it's important that we put items in order in terms of the various emergency operation centers spinning up and how they spin up, because that factors into the back end, which we're trying to talk about, right?
Scott Burns for the record. Thank you for the opportunity to clarify. As Mr. Lockwood mentioned, we have heard lots of concerns raised about emergency preparedness, and I want to make some comments to give the Commission and the public a sense of confidence on this. So to introduce my comments, I would say we'll assume that an emergency has happened today. So OPG would go through a process of identifying and activating the emergency procedures and notifying the province and the CNSC as per those guidelines. OPG, CNSC, the province, the City of Toronto, and the Region of Durham would all activate their Emergency Operations Center. I'm not sure why this is happening right now, but I was not part of the planning. So all of these organizations, Health Canada as well, we've heard from them, they would activate their Emergency Operations Center. People would start arriving, trained experts, professionals would start arriving to each of those emergency operations centers and take up their roles and responsibilities within those. They would have procedures to follow with respect to their specific role, and they would begin to work on those things. Within the province, we've heard health would be there, transportation would be there, we'd have scientists looking at the plant emergency data, which gets automatically transferred to the province and to the CNSC from OPG. We would be, if we're thinking about what's happening later, reception centers would be activated, emergency worker centers would be activated. If we use the example of the Durham region, school boards, hospitals, long-term care facilities, child care facilities, they'd all be notified. The region knows their lists of folks. Public alerting would begin. We have a whole system for that. Inside the region, and I'm speaking a little bit for the region, but inside their specific roles, so you've asked for details, the roles inside the Emergency Operations Center for the region would include health, Dr. Kyle's group, social services, police, fire, EMS would have representation in there, works department, transit, and under those specific roles, there's a whole army of people that would be responding to this. This would be everyone's priority on this day. And all of these centers, all of these people would have two focuses. We'd have off-site focus and we'd have on-site focus. The two priorities for off-site would be protective action levels and communicating with the public. This whole army of people would be focused on those details. If it got to the point, so we've heard from the province about this ingestion planning zone, the contingency planning zone. They're divided into sectors, and the ingestion planning zone is divided into subzones. And the purposes of that is to assist the decision makers in making decisions around protective actions. So if we got to a place where we were looking at a hot spot, so to speak, we've heard from the province reference that earlier on in the week, it would be a smaller defined area that they would be focused on to deliver KI pills in the ingestion planning zone. I'd also mention at the same time there's other things happening. This would be happening and transpiring over time. There'd be consideration for a venting strategy, as that would be over time, many hours, before we got to the decision where the province gave direction to the region of Durham in that emergency operations center and that army of people underneath there that it's time to distribute KI. Our KI strategy is a stockpiling, which is found to be meet the requirements under the PNERP and the regulatory document. That strategy was discussed at our Nuclear Emergency Management Coordinating Committee. All the partners were there. It fits for our demographics. In the reception centers that we have 250,000, a 250,000 pills in those reception centers, ready to be distributed to the public.
So
the detailed planning would be the sole responsibility on that day of the Emergency Operations Center within the Durham region, and would be deployed through all of those functional responsibilities within that Emergency Operations Center and executed, implemented by the people that support that Emergency Operations Center. So we heard from the province earlier, their focus is not just on nuclear but emergency management. They deal with large-scale emergency and delivery of goods in a lot of different scenarios. They know how to execute this work. The emergency service personnel and organizations on the ground know how to execute this work. The plans closer to the source of the event that I'm talking about, the hypothetical event that I'm talking about, they require more detail because the urgency and the risk involved is greater closer to the source. This assumes that the emergency mitigating equipment and all the safety systems we heard about earlier in the week, they haven't worked.
Okay, look,
so
you keep repeating things that we already know.
I know you know.
And we understand this. We ask a very specific question. I want to follow the pills. I'm not interested in anything else.
Okay.
I want to know where the pills, you mentioned 25 reception area. Where are they? Where the location? What's in each reception area? Why can't we get a straight answer? So please get to it.
The reception centers contain 250.
Where are they? Are they cover the whole 50-kilometer zone?
They are in the contingency planning zone.
What about the 50K zone?
So in terms of the 50-kilometer zone, we have a host community that's outside of a host reception center, a host community that's outside of that. There are not reception centers currently located. As I mentioned, the contingency planning zone is the name of it states that there will be contingency plans in place. That is part of the Provincial Nuclear Emergency Response Plan, and organizations responsible for these plans are looking at and starting to implement these
There is something called 50-kilometer ingestion zone.
Correct.
There is two regulatory provision that makes it clear that you have to have distribution of that, some plan for distribution. We have not yet seen that plan. So excuse me, okay, I'd like to turn to staff now. And again, let's go through those two requirements. They're not guidance, they're requirements. And I want to understand what is the plan for fulfilling those two requirements. And Dr. Sandor, you can jump right in there. I know there's something dear to your heart.
Just for background, because I like the here and now analogy, the Nuclear Emergency Preparedness and Response Reg Doc was put out in version 1 in 2014. That's 4 years ago. Version 2, 2016, but there was no change to the language that for the ingestion planning zone there should be pre-stocking and efficient distribution and particular concern to sensitive populations such as children and pregnant women. So if we're talking about the here and now, if we had to distribute KI pills in the ingestion planning zone, I just need to know how, who's accountable, who's responsible, and how will it be distributed in an efficient manner. That's all I want. I really understand the detailed planning zone. I really understand the contingency is scalable, but there's been a significant lack. I just need the details to understand how it will be distributed and who's accountable so that I can feel comfortable that it is there and it can be distributed in an efficient, especially to the vulnerable populations.
So I don't want to put, I understand there is a transition of government, I understand bureaucracy issues, I understand turf, I understand all those things. Just please share with us what is that you can share with us now and what you can share with us later if it doesn't exist.
Mike Morton for the Record Office of the Fire Marshal and Emergency Management. I'm going to turn to Kathy Blyer, who's our Senior Nuclear Emergency Preparedness Officer. She'll speak just a little bit more about these zones, and apologies if a little bit of that is on the record previously, but I think it's really important to understand the scenarios in which KI would be considered. This is not about simultaneous distribution to everybody within a 50-kilometer zone, and these scenarios have been carefully modeled by Health Canada, who could speak further to some of the specific credible scenarios that again have been peer reviewed. Kathy will just talk a little bit about this under the severe accident, which really is the only time where we would have indication of KI ingestion. And again, KI ingestion having a very specific purpose during a situation where radioactive iodine could be inhaled as a plume passes over. We are always going to prefer to evacuate people, to have them not exposed to radiation, and that's why the automatic actions are in place that Lori outlined in the 3-kilometer zone, as well as very specific and detailed preparations and actions in the detailed planning zone. So Kathy will take us a little bit into the overall scenario, how that relates to the CPZ. Again, Health Canada may want to emphasize some of the specifics of that scenario. And then Jonathan Stone, who's our manager of the Planning Exercise Unit, he's ready to speak to the specifics that have been asked about the reg doc.
I think just for timing, the precision I want is today, the Chief Medical Officer says, yes, there's a plume, distribute the KI. I want to know who and how, and the accountability. There's a lot of scenarios, but today you got a zone, you got a certain sector of people you can't evacuate, you got to distribute it. Who and how? Who's the accountability? Who are the players?
Mike Morton, for the record, I think we can provide further detail on that through the scenario itself, which is the only scenario in which case we'd be considering this outside of the 10, which is the severe accident scenario. So I'll just leave to Kathy or Jonathan to decide who is best to go first on this, but to provide us with that context.
So I don't want to be repetitive, so I'll try and narrow the focus down as far as possible. So when we did the planning basis review, we looked at a severe accident scenario. So based on that severe accident scenario, and specifically in terms of the need to ingest KI pills, the modeling indicated that the dose, the intervention level for KI pill ingestion would be reached out to 7 kilometers. And that 7 kilometers was looking at sort of the mean dose. So we looked at 2 doses, or Health Canada actually looked at 2 doses, mean dose and maximum dose. So the mean dose was the average dose. And in terms of the mean dose defines a zone where exceeding the generic criteria or intervention level is highly probable, and to that distance in a range of directions. So basically, given that dose being reached, we're looking at the entire radius potentially having to ingest KI pills. In terms of a maximum dose, a maximum dose defines the area where the risk is in a very specific direction and range best defined by environmental monitoring. So basically, you've got the mean dose, which we found would go out to a 7-kilometer area where KI ingestion might be needed. The maximum dose was 33 kilometers, so that, of course, takes us into the ingestion planning zone. But that would be in a very specific direction under the plume. So basically, again, our first protective measure of choice is evacuation. Under even the most severe accident scenario, there is the element of time where we could call for an evacuation. For the event where there might be some kind of severe weather situation where people can't evacuate, or where there are some people left in the area who can't evacuate, we could do a focused distribution of KI pills to that area. So in terms of the way we see the accident progressing, to do pre-distribution out to a whole 50-kilometer area just doesn't make a whole lot of sense, given that in this highly unlikely scenario, and on top of that, the highly unlikely weather event that would prevent people from leaving the area before the plume, we could undertake a focused distribution
It's the kind of thing we do under different kinds of emergency situations. We would involve emergency responders to take the pills out to the area that's needed. So that's basically how we foresee the situation going.
So even in your scenario, who distribute the pills in the 33 kilometers? Where do they get the pill from? And who actually distribute it?
Do you want to do it?
Jonathan Stone, OFMEM for the record. So as noted, at present there are 6 million doses of potassium iodide that are pre-stocked, available, and stored at the provincial government pharmacy in the GTA. Now this
Is it one? Sorry, I'm going to interrupt you. Is it one place?
Yes. So the 6 million doses for the IPZ are stored at the provincial government pharmacy in the GTA. Now this constitutes a credible location as required in Section 2.3.4 of Reg Doc 210.1. These pills have been procured by OPG as required. They're stored under the control of the Ministry of Health and Long-Term Care. These doses do account for sufficient numbers of pills to cover populations of children under 18, pregnant women, and breastfeeding women. That's also consistent with the requirement of Reg Doc 210.1. So that constitutes your sensitive populations. These pills are located in a place so that they can be readily accessed and efficiently and promptly provided to members of the public as required based on the scenario that has just been discussed. The location of these pills was selected by the provincial KI working group following the publication of Reg Doc 210.1. The working group included our office, the Ministry of Health and Long-Term Care, the licensee as required by the license. So everyone who needed to be involved in the discussion pursuant to the Reg Doc was involved with selecting the location, and the justification for that really relates to the requirement within the PNERP master plan. So at Annex I of the master plan, there's a requirement for the Ministry of Health and Long-Term Care and OFMEM to develop and maintain a strategy for the distribution of pills within the IPZ as necessary during an emergency. So the distribution strategy would rely on the mechanisms that we have in place. As noted by OPG, the PIOC is regularly called on to undertake complex emergency response and emergency logistics operations throughout Ontario, notably to coordinate the evacuation of communities threatened by floods and forest fires. So we frequently move large numbers of people from remote northern communities into host communities far away. So we're not moving pills safely, we're moving people safely. We do that every year on a regular basis. We just completed an evacuation and repatriation of James Bay Coast communities this spring. We also did it last year. So the experience gained through these operational activities would be used to coordinate the emergency distribution of KI in the IPZ. These aren't exercises. These are the results of real operations that we do on an annual basis. So the strategy for the distribution of KI pills within the IPZ as necessary to the specific locations would be as follows. Should the need arise to coordinate the distribution, the PIOC would coordinate that delivery as part of the overall response strategy. We wouldn't be able to know, obviously, in advance where the pills would need to go, because that would be based on modeling. So the PIOC scientific section would use modeling to determine exactly where within the IPZ these pills would need to go and where that specific distribution would be. And again, keeping in mind the key holding strategy, these would in large part be sent to places for people who could not be evacuated.
So I understand that.
Okay.
So just stop for a sec, please.
Right.
So let's say you've got a plume, you got to distribute. All I want to know is who has the accountability to go to this central radiopharmacy, pick up the drugs, and transfer them to the sites that are within that plume, within that modeling. Is the Office of the Fire Marshal accountable for the physical delivery, or is it another? I know this is multi-jurisdictional, but I need a mechanical answer to who is accountable for distributing if the decision to distribute is made.
Just to make it even more complicated, we are there's a clock going. Those KI pills, if you're going to be 2 days later, forget about this. So there is a clock. You want to do it in time to be as most effective as possible. That's why we're so preoccupied with distribution. Because if it comes from one center and you have to distribute to 300,000 people, let's assume the plume is right through all those schools, but I have no idea how you're going to do it.
Mike Morton for the record. Building on what Kathy Blyer said about the scenario and understanding this is a limited geographic scope, specifically of people that could not be evacuated. And from what we heard on Tuesday from Ministry of Transportation, as well as the statistics and timings that they have provided at past hearings, even beyond the 10 kilometers in terms of evacuation, and based on the scenario that Kathy outlined, it is very possible to evacuate people from these zones, and particularly in an area of geographic focus based on modeling before and up to a release. So if these pills had to be distributed, again, it is on a limited basis. To specifically answer the question about distribution, all of these decisions are through the Provincial Emergency Operations Centre in terms of leading the emergency response. We are the legislated lead of that. The ingestions of the pills that we heard is ordered by the Chief Medical Officer of Health. We have at our disposal in such an emergency all of the emergency response resources of the province of Ontario and, if necessary, of the federal government and neighbouring jurisdictions. The legislation is clear that we can direct those resources. So every municipal emergency responder and provincial emergency responder, federal responder could be utilized to carry out these actions, to take pills to the targeted populations that could not evacuate, or the choice was made not to if we felt more harm would be done through such an evacuation, to provide them with those pills. And to be really clear, not only are pills at the government pharmacy, that's for the 6 million doses targeted to the IPZR, but as OPG has indicated, they are staged at locations throughout the entire radius of the 10-kilometer zone as well, and those locations are specifically in the plan. So it's not just that if there was an issue with the provincial pharmacy, they could be drawn from those other sites which are very geographically dispersed.
So that really helps that we got there. So just for the record and to make sure I'm understanding, the accountability and the responsibility for the delivery of KI pills, if need be, is with the Office of the Fire Marshal.
Mike Morton for the record. That is correct. We take our lead from our cabinet, of course, who has the ultimate responsibility, the Cabinet Committee on Emergency Management, for all emergencies in Ontario, and who approves the PNERP, and the Provincial Emergency Operations Centre is the mechanism through which the government coordinates and actions its command and coordination activities.
Again, I would argue that staff, as a regulatory, if you like, compliance, you'd want to make sure that you understand the process in great detail. If you wait, normally those accidents happen at 2 o'clock in the morning. There is no cabinet. And by the time you wait for cabinet decision, it'll be all over in terms of effectiveness. So you want to make sure that you have the authority a priori delegated to you guys to, in case of an emergency, to be able to ring the bell and things to happen.
Mike Morton for the record, and apologies if any sort of delay was implied by my comment. We have a strong system of delegated authorities. Our Provincial Emergency Operations Centre operates 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year. It is staffed at all times. This is not an on-call system. We have officers in place in our operations center, and we have delegated decision-making processes 24 hours a day. We are actually required to set off-site response levels within 15 minutes of OPG notifying us of any circumstance. So even from the most minor reportable events up to a general emergency, we have 15 minutes to provide direction to all of our emergency response partners, including the designated municipalities and ministries of the government, on the predetermined automatic and procedural actions that they would take under any scenario that develops from the facility. That authority comes from Cabinet, and that's why we have a Cabinet-level plan that allows us to take those actions, to make those decisions without delay. So there's absolute vigilance on this and a very well-practiced system that has multiple drills per week within the Ontario government, and on a regular basis on more minor reportable events, regulatory events, and so on, has proven over and over for decades that we can do that within the 15-minute timeline.
Stensil.
First of all, that's a lot to respond to, and I'll try to make it concise. The top line that I heard in all of that back and forth is that the new PNERP is adequate and we're waiting for a study to confirm it. So in this way, we're very similar to 2013 when we were in these hearings. We heard the same messaging that the PNERP is adequate. And for the new commissioners, Commissioner Velshi, you may be a bit bored of this, but what has driven a lot of the debate that we just heard was due to, after Fukushima, interveners and Greenpeace asking for evidence to demonstrate the adequacy of off-site emergency management. What people said was, we need studies, modeling of what an accident would look like off-site, so that we can see whether this is, we don't want just assurances. And the fact that we're still waiting for a study to definitively confirm these things 8 years later shows you that interveners have been patient and persistent. We're getting to better decisions, but we still have a ways to go. And what's behind that originally is, I think, the Commission staff and the Canadian industry has had a blind spot to off-site the impacts of off-site emergencies. They're almost scared of their own shadow. They seem to think if you modeled a big accident like this from a credible, Health Canada, that it would be the end of their company. And I think that's been shown not to be the case. So I would encourage them to be more forthright moving forward. But we have a lot, we're still yet to be on par with European regulators that did similar studies within 3 years after Fukushima. So all that is said, Commissioner Velshi, in your presidency, this will be an ongoing thing, but I think we can get up to those levels over time. So that's the first background. For KI, in regard to KI, or in my comments, I'm going to quickly try to summarize where I think there's evidence on the record for you to act based on what you know already and have heard and what you have not been told, and also where you need to continue asking questions for more evidence and to provoke improvements to off-site emergency management. And to start with KI, the story that was not said is the biggest improvement to the 2017 PNERP was caused by the Commission's implementation of the Reg Doc on emergency management in 2014. That came in response to the 2013 Pickering hearings and what you heard from commissioners about from interveners related to the inadequacy of off-site emergency response and complacency within the provincial government and within OPG. So that is to your credit. You have moved this file forward. That complacency, however, still exists, and I think we've heard it in these hearings. In that, 5 years after that guide, I think Commissioner Demeter, you mentioned this, we still don't have clarity on how it's being implemented. And even when the PNERP was under review last year, in spite of the fact that the Commission had put out this Reg Doc, the discussion paper put out by the province said we will not be including KI within the planning basis. It was really weird. Luckily, Greenpeace was in agreement with CNSC staff and municipalities that said, no, we want this. This is something that the public wants. So now the question comes to implementation, and I think for your decision making, your guide should still be your Reg Doc and not the PNERP. I actually see it as stronger than the wording that came out in the 2007 PNERP, and you have the licensing authority to drive improvements to provincial offsite emergency management, and I encourage you to continue doing that. The issue related to KI, I think the tangible thing that you can act on in these hearings is related to vulnerable communities and whether what we just heard is adequate and believable. And I don't think it is. We've already heard that Bruce Power made a decision to stockpile KI where the most vulnerable are. This makes sense. No matter which way the plume will go, they made that decision. But we don't really have clarity on why there was a decision to not stockpile it around OPG's facilities. That's very unclear to me. Going back to cost-benefit analysis, I worry it may have had something to do with that. No one's just putting that forward. Ironically, President Binder, after 10 years at your last commission meeting, by the line of your questions, I think we agree on this one. It took 10 years. It's just like Groundhog Day. I think you have clearly, you have a rule that needs to be applied, and I would recommend that you apply it consistently by adopting the Bruce Power model. You have a public expectation for this. You heard from the TTSB, but also all the municipalities, including Durham Region and Toronto, have asked for KI pre-distribution to be expanded. So this is something that will be welcomed. And while we keep hearing from the line, we're waiting for a technical study to confirm whether this is adequate, you already have the evidence base to direct stockpiling in schools. It is from your own staff. It's in my supplementary submission. CNSC staff, in their submission to the PNERP review, basically, effectively said, I can't find the citation, both the SARP study and the Health Canada study show that vulnerable communities will need ready access, may need ready access to this based on those two studies that I think are inadequate. We don't need to wait for this other study. You have a basis already to move forward on that. And that came from your staff. So I'm in agreement with them. It was not adopted explicitly in the PNERP, but I think that may be for a lot of reasons that are out of scope here. So for KI, I encourage you to move forward on that. The second issue that came up over and over again around the zones, we're waiting for them to be confirmed. What we've learned, I think, by starting to model larger accidents is that the zones in which we've traditionally or historically planned for detailed or flexible measures are probably too small. And there was this contingency zone that has been superimposed that no one really knows what it does. It doesn't have any additional requirements, and we're told that it's for severe accidents. I did some looking for the source of it. It's based in the CSA guide from 2014. When I went back to look at where the source from the CSA guide was, it was an IAEA guide that based it on the IAEA's recommended of something called the extended planning distance, that you deal with hotspots, this type of contingency planning. In other countries, that extended planning distance is about 100 kilometers. And when staff were talking about the benchmarking with Switzerland the other day, they did not mention the extended planning zone. It's 100 kilometers in Switzerland. So I expect in the future, I don't think it'll be at this hearing, we'll see an expansion of the ingestion planning zone, and the contingency planning zone is a half measure, as I stated. So I think that's an area where you need to continue asking questions that I don't think were sufficiently covered. And aside, also, something in front of you is about public awareness and advertising. Dr. Kyle just spoke. And one of the ways that we can create more conservatism in emergency management is by having more people aware to order the pills. It's fewer people to distribute to over time. There are ads in GO stations within Durham Region. About a year ago, I noticed that those ads said, if you are within the 10 kilometers, you can order KI pills. And I was like, well, actually, if you're within the 50 kilometers, you can order those KI pills. And I sent a note to Dr. Kyle as the Chief Medical Officer of Health for Durham Region, and I said, this doesn't make sense. The Reg Doc actually says 50 kilometers. Your own council has said we would like expanded KI delivery. I didn't hear back from him. He's a busy man. But I have noticed that the messaging and the advertising has changed to 50 kilometers. I don't see that yet in Toronto, but what this indicates to me is the mindset is still do the bare minimum for availability.
We have a biological challenge here. It's been 2 hours. We need a break. So the question is, do we have a lot more to discuss? So you'll have to stick around. We're going to take a 15-minute break. Come at 10:45 to 11. Can't read this. 10:45 to 11. Thank you.
Thank you.
As you know, a number of interveners expressed concerns about lack of awareness about the nuclear facility and emergency management, particularly folks from the GTA. And the City of Toronto, in their submission, have also asked the province and the CNSC to undertake some action to address this need. So my question to you is, do you have any plans to address this need, and what are they?
Mike Morton, for the record, Office of the Fire Marshal and Emergency Management. On Tuesday, we did provide some background as to the current requirements, and particularly with respect to the committees that are developed for each of the areas around the nuclear facilities. And we did hear from OPG about the extensive education efforts that have taken place in the detailed planning zone, 130,000 kits distributed and so on. So we do feel that measures in that area have been quite substantial and based on the information we have been effective in getting across their message. We also spoke to the Canada-wide education program that we've been very involved with around public alerting, the Alert Ready program, because public alerting is such an important element of any emergency, and particularly of a nuclear emergency, to ensure that Ontarians know how they will be alerted and what to do if they are alerted. That said, our committee that looks at the area around the Pickering Nuclear Generating Station, and again, many of the stakeholders are on this, including OPG, are indeed looking at ways that they can further increase awareness. This is actually going to be a topic of their next meeting. We heard about some of those efforts before the break with respect to advertising, about how people can get pills within not just the 10K zone, but the 50K zone. The group recognizes that there are further opportunities. Despite having really good mechanisms and systems online where people can go on and very quickly learn about pills, order pills, have them shipped if they're anywhere in the 50K zone. We do feel that we can do more in this area, and the group is exploring strategies to do that, understanding that every municipality is required to have an emergency management public education program, that our programs are risk-based, and there are a large number of topics that we at the Office of Fire Marshal and Emergency Management and our municipal emergency management counterparts want to ensure that people are aware of, various hazards from weather to technological, and balancing that is always an important consideration and challenge. But our group is looking at opportunities to go even further. And I'm not sure if this is something OPG as a member of that committee.
Well, let me ask you the specific question, because the City of Toronto has asked the province and the CNSC to do this. And I think what I'm hearing you saying is that this is a municipality responsibility, and really the city itself should be doing it, maybe getting help and resources and support from the other parties, but it is their responsibility.
Mike Morton, for the record. So there's two discrete things that are being discussed. There's the general requirement under the Emergency Management and Civil Protection Act for all of Ontario's 444 municipalities to have public education programs, and it is risk-specific. It states that those programs should reflect the identified risks through the mandatory risk assessment that each community carries out, and our communities across Ontario do have those programs. This area is somewhat unique in that there are additional requirements for risk-specific public education for the nuclear facilities. And again, those requirements through the PNERP place additional requirements on those areas. So we would, through the PNERP, see this very much as a shared responsibility. The province works to coordinate those public education committees, the municipalities actively participate, and across the province the operators do provide significant resources to support the implementations of those programs. They've invested heavily in those programs, and they've expressed an openness and interest in continuing to support those. So when the group meets, Toronto is a part of those discussions, Durham's a part of those discussions. They are looking at strategies to, from the perspective of the risk assessments and what target audiences would need to know what at what point. There is the opportunity to put forward those ideas, to propose strategies directly with the operators, and in the past where that's occurred, that's led to the campaigns that we have now. And again, the industry has put a lot of financial support toward those.
Is the CNSC part of that group?
Mike Morton for the record. As far as I know, the CNSC does not directly participate in that, but those groups report to the Nuclear Emergency Management Coordinating Committee. They're actually subcommittees of that, and the CNSC is on the overall coordinating committee.
So that raises an interesting regulatory question. In your reg doc about that particular subject and about the distribution and make it available for the 50K, is there any communication requirement under that to make this program effective? So in other words, we've been hearing all along that the KI pill are available if you ask for it. But somebody got to know what is that I have to ask for. Somebody has to know that it's available. So the vast majority of people that don't know about this, they're not going to ask for it. So how do we overcome that challenge?
Jerry Frappy, for the record, I'd ask Richard Tennant to talk a bit about our compliance program associated with this reg doc.
Richard Tennant for the record. With respect for what compliance activities we implement to oversee the distribution of KI, the reg doc applies to the licensee. So what we've done is we've kept in contact with the licensee, looked at records and management systems, and kept track of the progress of how the distribution was implemented. We also, through site staff, have been able to inquire as to where they live in the GTA, for example, and ask whether or not they've received the product and pills. So we've kept abreast, we kept a finger on the pulse through communications with the licensees, and we're aware that it has been distributed. Also through participation with the, as I mentioned, EMCC, the Emergency Management Coordinating Committee with the province. We're also in dialogue and aware of the progress through that avenue as well. So we're very well up to speed on of how the KI has been disseminated, pre-distributed and stockpiled since the reg doc came into effect.
But again, we do have an outreach program. CNSC has an outreach program. I don't understand why you wouldn't, within the outreach program, make it a requirement that within the 50K it's known that those pills are available if you go to that site and ask for it.
It's Megan Garish for the record. Within the CNSC's outreach program, there are many avenues where licensees as well as CNSC staff go out and make this known to the public. Now, with OPG, there is a requirement to communicate with emergency responders as well as with us in terms of how are they communicating with the public to let them know that this is available. So up to the 50 kilometers, they have a plan in place, a proactive public relations program where they disseminate this information through various tools.
So if I hear you politely saying, yes, we can become a little bit more requirement to make sure that there's a campaign to all residents within 50K?
Yes, I believe that that's something that we can achieve together.
Okay, thank you, Ms. Vilke. Question? Dr. Demeter.
Thank you. This is a question for the epidemiologist with Durham Health. Sorry, I forgot your name. So a number of interveners have brought up issues of health status around nuclear power plants and around Pickering. Based on your sort of health status reports and health status indicators, can you comment if there's any unusual clusters or concerns relative to chronic diseases, specifically cancer, any health status issues relative to low birth weight or congenital abnormalities? Like, is there anything that sticks out that makes people who live around a nuclear power plant, this time Pickering, different than provincial standards?
Mary Ann Petrusiak for the record. We have done a lot of work around health status in Durham Region and in Pickering and the municipalities, and also in the health neighborhoods. And no, there's nothing that comes out in terms of particularly higher rates that would be linked to the nuclear plants. For example, childhood cancers are not higher in Durham Region. In terms of cancer rates for Pickering, we do not typically have cancer data below Durham Region level. So except for special studies where we have done on radiation and health, typically we look at Durham Region as a whole.
And maternal fetal health status indicators?
Mary Ann Petrusiak, in terms of fetal maternal health, Pickering actually does very well in terms of those kinds of indicators. There are some higher rates for small for gestational age, and that is likely due to the ethnic population. We have a lot of immigrants in Ajax Pickering area, and we cannot, when we're looking at small for gestational age, we can't look at what the ethnic makeup is, and we do know that we do have a fairly high population of Asian as well in those areas, so they typically have smaller babies. Not necessarily that is a higher risk to health. So generally we have actually extremely positive indicators for Pickering and for Durham Region. There are some rates that are higher depending on what you're looking at. A lot of this information is available in durham.ca/neighborhoods or /health stats. We have cancer reports, we have detailed reports for health neighborhoods, for our 50 health neighborhoods in Durham Region.
Thank you very much.
Just as a follow-up, did you have a chance to read Dr. Fairley's presentation and his recommendation that women and pregnant women should move out of Pickering?
Mary Ann Petrusiak, in terms, I did look at Dr. Fairley's report. In terms of the methodology of that report, from what I understand, basically they took the Fukushima plume and just adjusted it to Durham Region, which doesn't really apply. And so in terms of a recommendation like that, I would say totally no, of course, pregnant women and children have very healthy environment within Durham Region, and
he had two studies. Sorry, I should have said. He had a study on that all living near NPPs globally is not healthy to you. It's not good for you.
Yeah, Mary Ann Petrusiak, I'm sorry, I can't really comment on that, but in terms of all nuclear power plants, but in terms of Durham Region, I would say that we have a particularly healthy population. Typically, Durham Region is very similar to Ontario, which is similar to Canada, and Canada does well globally in terms of a lot of its comparators for health indicators. That's not to say that there aren't areas of improvement, there always are. In terms of our areas of focus, we tend to look more at health equity. We have 7 priority neighborhoods in Durham Region that are linked to lower income, and those areas definitely do show poorer health status compared to other areas in health. And none of those priority neighborhoods are in Pickering, I might add. There is downtown Ajax, downtown Whitby, and then 5 neighborhoods in Oshawa. So those are really, for us, more of a priority in terms of improving the health of the population.
Thank you. Question? I think it's over. The last word is for you.
First, I'll do a little bit of cleanup because I didn't finish what I was going to say before the end of the break. That's okay. On the question of advertising within the 50K area, Commissioner Velshi, you were asking questions about this. I would remind the Commission that even the programs that are in place now within the detailed planning zone were driven by your licensing authority, not by the province and the multi-jurisdictional committees that you've been hearing about. Those committees are very slow. So you have the authority to, as I said at the top of my presentation, spur momentum in exercising in your ruling. And I urge you to do that. What we've heard about the awareness campaigns is there's already one in place across Durham Region. OPG is fine with that, but we haven't seen it over into Toronto. So there's a blind spot there. And as I mentioned off the top again, what we've learned about the recent studies that we've had since Fukushima is that the geographic risk footprint of the station is larger than we thought in the 1970s. So that's why we need these types of campaigns based on the evidence. One small suggestion that maybe staff could undertake, I've been told by my colleague in Belgium for KI distribution in their extended planning zone, which is 100 kilometers. I don't have confirmation of this from actually reading their document, but what has been conveyed to me is that under the new Belgium system is doctors are actually instructed to prompt parents and pregnant women when they visit a doctor's office to ask them if they have ordered their KI pills. That could be a very simple thing that could be implemented within the GTA to start addressing that specific regulatory requirement. So just a suggestion to throw out there. The other piece that I wanted to talk about, and it goes back to momentum, you've heard a lot at these hearings from all sides on the multi-jurisdictional committees that make decisions on emergency management. They're all great people, but these committees are actually part of the problem that we've been seeing. They're the bottleneck. I think we heard the other night in the first round of questions on stocking KI in schools, OPG said something along the lines of, we would never make a unilateral decision to change the stocking plan without the consent of the rest of these committees. Bruce Power did. And right there, I think, is part of the problem where you can help address that. The Nuclear Emergency Management Coordination Committee, which you've heard about a lot, operates by consensus. And as an intervener that intervenes in the public interest, what I worry about is OPG and Bruce Power are on this committee, and if it operates by consensus, if there is a proposal to go beyond, to seek the best, that may be against their financial interests based on the process, there'll be a disincentive to doing that. A clear example is that those committees made a decision against KI pre-distribution after Fukushima. This commission, though, came to the opposite conclusion. So So that's why there needs to be very close monitoring of these committees. And the Commission could also mandate staff to be, if it works by consensus, staff can also have a role in making sure that consensus pushes forward and is not brought to the bottom. You'll find in my submission a complaint. I have what's called an integrity complaint that I have filed I've sent to the Deputy Minister of Community Safety. And that is related to my concern that OPG, the ministry has been borrowing staff from Ontario Power Generation to fulfill its role. For a public service intervener, if this were pipelines, this would be like asking Kinder Morgan to come up with the emergency plan. It hurts the credibility and the trustworthiness of what you hear. And what I documented in my submission is that an OPG staffer was actually involved in the PNERP review behind the scenes. So this is what I was intervening in, and others have been demanding for years. OPG was actually, it wasn't the government that we seek to defend the public interest. There was a role of OPG in that process, and it's unclear to me what steps were taken to avoid conflict of interest. So when I hear the 2017 PNERP is adequate, and yet the only major upgrades to that plan were the KI requirements that this Commission triggered in 2014, I'm not satisfied that this plan is in fact adequate, and we have a lot more to do. And so I wanted to bring that up because I think CNSC staff could have a very good role in making that committee more transparent. They also deny access to freedom of information requests constantly, which raises more issues. So as you can see, there is a problem in the operations and governance of this issue, and it goes back to the main point of my submission, is that you're not only licensing OPG, you are licensing the province. They're sharing staff, and in that you should feel a large mandate to exercise your licensing authority to drive continuous improvement of the PNERP. You have done it before. You should do it again. Commissioner Velshi, in your presidency, we may end up having a review of the Nuclear Safety Control Act. In the United States, there are elements of the legislation that allow the NRC to review municipal and state level emergency plans. We're effectively doing that in an informal way here, but that might be an improvement we could bring to the Act that I'm happy to work with you on. So all that is to say, I don't have trust in the 2007 PNERP. We know continuous improvement will be coming, but I urge you to continue asking questions. And in your decision, you've been given a few very tangible things where you can take action where there's sufficient evidence on KI pre-stocking in Toronto and on awareness campaigns, and perhaps setting some timelines for implementation. So I encourage you to do that. So in conclusion, because I can see you're getting antsy, President, one issue that we didn't in fact talk about at all was the siting issue, which was the focus of my presentation. And the focus of my presentation was on the fifth level of defense in depth. And this discussion has effectively been on emergency management, which is an aspect of that. And I mentioned in my presentation that according to the IAEA, you need three elements for defense in depth. The safety culture. I think I've just pointed out there's some issues with safety culture in the way that these bodies interact. They're all great people, but I think as operations, there's something not working in the public interest. Conservatism. When we're hearing these comments about being able to distribute KI from one point in the city of Toronto at 2 a.m. in the morning, as you said, Mr. President, I don't see any data to show is that adequate. I made a recommendation in my submission actually for parallel to evacuation time estimates. If this is the way we're going to do, maybe there should be a requirement for KI distribution time estimates for the City of Toronto, because I don't think this is believable. And there's no evidence to substantiate it. And so in terms of the IAEA requirement, I don't think they meet that. And the final one is quality assurance. And as we've seen over the past 7 years, I don't think they're there. I bring this up because I think there's a role CNSC staff could have in trying to implement these elements to the fifth level of defense in depth. A lot of this is over my head, but I don't see it in the way it's rolling out right now. But back to siting. The other element of the fifth level of defense in depth is controlling land use. And as has been brought up with other interveners in these hearings, is there are no limits to population growth around the Pickering station. This doesn't pass the common sense test for most people, that you can just operate an old nuclear reactor in an urban area. This is not an issue of whether OPG complies with the CNSC regulation. It's a question of whether the CNSC has adequate regulations on this factor. And Greenpeace and CELA have tried to constructively intervene in this process over the past 10 years, commenting on the siting guides, for example, and we're told it's a provincial issue. We filed a request for review by the environmental commissioner for the Ministry of Municipal Affairs to actually set standards. They brushed us off and said we just updated in 2014. Those rules are inadequate. So again, this comes back to you and your licensing authority. You have the ability under the Canadian Nuclear Safety Control Act to ensure that there's adequate provision for the protection of the public. On siting, we don't have any rules. We don't have any limits. We don't have any conservatisms that have been discussed in these hearings. So I think there's latitude for you to act, and this is where it comes back to Groundhog Day. There is a provision in the License Control Handbook that OPG could by December 31st, 2020 to apply to operate the reactor longer. So this would be coming back to Groundhog Day again. And I think we're at the point where you should be able to say enough is enough. And if you're going to come back again, and your government, your shareholder, is knowingly increasing population around the Pickering nuclear station, you have a responsibility to do something about it. So in the same way that this commission has intervened and forced action from the Ministry of Community Safety, I think in the event that there's a reapplication in 2022, you have a responsibility to intervene so that the Ministry of Municipal Affairs shows how that it will, at a minimum, maintain safety margins for off-site management. So for this reason, Greenpeace respectfully makes the following request for ruling under Rule 23 of the CNSC's Rules of Procedure. I will provide it to Mark by email after this presentation. Greenpeace requests that the Commission include an additional requirement related to land use planning in Section 15.4 of the License Control Handbook. The License Control Handbook currently lists a series of analysis and reports OPG must provide the Commission by December 31st, 2022 if it applies to operate any Pickering unit beyond 2024. Greenpeace requests this list be amended to include documentation to show OPG will ensure that it can control the use and occupation of land within 20 kilometers of the Pickering site to maintain safety margins for the fifth level of defense in depth by preventing the intensification and development of residential dwellings. This could include the province's growth plan for the Golden Horseshoe, which is scheduled to be updated in the middle of 2022. I think I've summarized my reasons for this. I think it is a very reasonable request, and I think it's an incumbent on the Commission for this site, of any site with your mandate under the Nuclear Safety Control Act, to cause irreplaceable harm to Canadian society. You must ensure that there are rules in place to maintain safety at the fifth level of defense in depth. We have not seen it. OPG has already taken us through this once in 2013. We're here again, and if they come back, they should be expect sanction from the Commission, because the Ministry of Energy was aware of it when they approved the life extension originally in 2010. They're knowingly have policies that undermine public safety. With that, I'll conclude. President Binder, I wish you well in your retirement. It's been a great ride. And Commissioner Velshi, I look forward to working with you in the future.
Thank you.